Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar on de-escalation and youth in crisis. Your presenters today are Rachel Graham and Megan Wall. Before I introduce the both of them, I just want to go over a few key reminders. The presentation will run up until 2:45, 2:50, and we will dedicate a question and answer session about 5 to 10 minutes towards the end of the hour. So if you have any questions, comments, or concerns you would like to add or ask, please feel free to drop them in the chat box. Please remember to mute your sound throughout the whole webinar. And if you're comfortable, please feel free to turn on your video. As I mentioned, your presenters today are Rachel Graham and Megan Wall. Rachel and Megan are both graduate students in the EDS program at the School Psychology Department at the University of Utah. Rachel and Megan are both team leads at the Wellbeing Team program at Summit School District. Welcome, Rachel and Megan. We're very excited to have you here today. Welcome to the UTTEC Lab webinar series. Welcome back. I am going to go ahead and turn the time over to you.
All right. So our topic today is de-escalation and youth in crisis. We are going to go over several topics, including what is a mental health crisis, crisis response teams and procedures, common crisis situations or behaviors in children and adolescents, the do's and don'ts of de-escalation, and then what makes effective de-escalation. So looking first at what a crisis is and what it entails. So we can see here that a mental health crisis is really any situation where a person's behavior puts them at risk of hurting themselves or others and prevents them from being able to care for themselves or function effectively. And there are many different things that can lead to a mental health crisis, but a crisis is also really just like a failure to cope. So not having the skills or ability at the time to be able to cope with stressors. And it's also been described as psychological disequilibrium, in that a person is confronted with like a hazardous circumstance or stress that causes a problem, and they don't have the ability to either escape or solve the problem the way they typically do. So that can cause a crisis. And it's important to understand and remember that not every crisis is a psychiatric emergency, and that with coordination among school staff and parents and other important adults, children can get the intervention and supports they need early on so that crises can be managed preemptively or in the school and outside of a hospital without having to go to the emergency room. So then why is this all important? It's important to understand what a crisis is in order to appropriately respond, particularly in a school setting, and being able to provide those services and intervening early on can really impact a student's overall trajectory. And so 1 in 6 youth or adolescents will experience a mental health condition in any given time. And 50% of all lifetime mental health conditions begin before the age of 14, and 75 start before the age of 24. So in a school, it's really important to be aware of this so that we can intervene early on and get students the services they need. It's also really important because Megan will talk later on about the school to prison pipeline, but 70% of youth in juvenile justice systems have at least one mental health condition. And so then a person who is having a mental health crisis can't really communicate their thoughts, feelings, needs, or emotions. So they can find it really difficult to understand what other people are saying. And so it's important to empathize and connect with the person's feelings, stay calm, and try to de-escalate the crisis. There are various types of emotional crises. So Dr. Bruce Baldwin developed 6 classes or types of crises that fall along a continuum. And along this continuum, crises become more serious, and the core of the crisis shifts from external to internal conflicts. So typically this model and these classes are used to teach different types of crisis intervention therapy and counseling, as well as support the interventions. In like the slides will kind of show what types of behaviors kind of go along with these. But if we look at the first type of crisis, we have dispositional. So it's kind of like the least severe. And in a dispositional crisis, an individual typically lacks the information and the encouragement to go about solving a problem in their typical way. So in general, the counseling strategy that's used with these students experiencing dispositional crises would just be to provide information, particularly information that they might not be able to obtain on their own. And then to just kind of clarify the problem and find those services. The next type of crisis is an anticipated life transition. So these are just the common transitions that children will experience over their lifetime. So entering school, moving from grade to grade, moving to another school, or moving from a self-contained special ed class to a mainstreamed one. And with this crisis, school personnel can help by understanding the changes that the student is experiencing and helping the student develop appropriate coping skills to deal with those changes. The next is traumatic stress. So these are the unexpected or uncontrolled externally imposed stressors. And there's 6 types of traumatic hazards, and those include severe illness, injury, violent or unexpected death, threatened death or injury, acts of war, natural disasters, and man-made industrial disasters. So some common traumatic events for children in school can also include a sudden death of a family member, an illness, hospitalization, parental disablement, parental divorce, physical abuse, pregnancy, sexual assault, or academic failure. And oftentimes a student facing one or more of these events is just totally emotionally overwhelmed and is unable to use their previously learned coping strategies. So to address these crises, it's crucial to provide support during the refractory period, so the time between the occurrence of the stressor and the student's ability to mobilize their coping skills. It's also helpful to help the student acknowledge and express the negative emotions that come from the traumatic stress, as well as help them find ways to cope with the resulting changes. The next type of crisis is maturational or developmental crises. And these are typically issues related to maturing and developing and can include things like dependency, conflicts in values, sexual identity, capacity for emotional intimacy, responses to authority, and self-discipline. And all of these issues can present in all children, but typically they're more prominent in adolescents. And these crises are different from others in that they usually occur within a pattern of relationship problems. And then in secondary schools, the attainment of sexual maturity can lead to a lot of these crises. And a focal point of many of these crises include challenges with parents and teachers and authority in general. So when addressing these issues, it's important to understand and identify any unresolved developmental challenges. And then the next is crisis reflecting psychopathology, or any type of crisis that's caused by pre-existing psychopathology. And so these types of crises typically require outside community resources, but school personnel can play a big role in preventing the crises and helping the students function as well as possible academically. Some possible crises can include like severe depression, hallucinations, or eating disorders. And in order to support students, it's helpful to help the student understand appropriate ways to respond in different situations. And so school personnel can also acknowledge and praise the student for any type of appropriate or productive behaviors in schools. And then school personnel can also help by finding ways to reduce stress or eliminate stressors that are pushing the child beyond their capacity to cope. So in addition, they can provide support, other school staff and parents who might also be experiencing kind of secondhand trauma from supporting the child. And then interventions, you can work with the student to build and expand basic problem solving skills. And then our last one is the most severe, and that's psychiatric emergencies. So it's the most severe class of crises. And in this case, a student's general functioning would be severely impacted, and types of crises in this class can include acutely suicidal children, alcohol intoxication, drug overdoses, reactions to hallucinogenic drugs, psychosis, uncontrollable anger. And these are all kind of what we think of when we think of a mental health crisis, where the individual is dangerous to themselves and others. And in this type of crisis, the goal is really to assess safety and danger by learning the physical and psychiatric condition of the student, and school personnel need to be able to gather facts to clarify the situation and take appropriate action as quickly as possible. And in this situation, a lot of the information gathered will likely come from other individuals and not the child. And it is possible that medical or psychological interventions may be necessary at a hospital. So then when dealing with all of these types of crises, it's helpful to have crisis response teams at schools, and schools developing a crisis response team should really consult and work with their school and district administration teams. The crisis response teams should first clearly define their roles and responsibilities, and there should be multiple people for each position or role in case of psychological or physical unavailability of a team member. The crisis, so there's several different roles. The first is the crisis intervention coordinator. And so the crisis intervention coordinator should have a background in social work, psychology, or counseling. The individual in this role should have a thorough understanding of the objectives, methods, and limitations of crisis intervention in schools. The individual in this role should be able to have knowledge and the ability to carry out or oversee mental health first aid and crisis interventions, as well as be able to connect students and families with community resources. The next role would be emergency and medical health coordinator. This is typically the school nurse who has training in medical first aid, as well as access and knowledge to first aid equipment. The school nurse can work closely with medical doctors and hospitals and emergency personnel, and the school nurse and the emergency medical health coordinator, their biggest role should be in prevention efforts. The next is the security and safety coordinator. And so this role would be to establish a connection with local police or local authorities to ensure that everyone is on the same page and is understanding what the crisis response team procedures are and what they look like and how they can support one another. The next is the media management coordinator, and this individual is responsible for sharing facts of what has happened with either the school, the community, but also maintaining privacy and confidentiality and being respectful of the students and individuals involved. And then finally, the last role is the debrief and evaluation facilitator. And so this individual has the role of evaluating the overall preparedness of the team and the school, as well as evaluating the effectiveness of the crisis responses. So this individual should be able to monitor and evaluate the mental health of the crisis workers as well. So if something happens in a school, this individual will kind of debrief and see what could we do better next time, what did we do well, and also check in with everybody on the team. So then once the team is formed, this is kind of the general procedure outline. So the first step is to assess the crisis situation and kind of find out what are the facts and determine the level of response needed. So is this something that a teacher can handle? Is it something that the whole team needs to handle? Can it be handled at a school level, a district level, or does the individual have to go to a hospital? Or do outside resources need to be contacted? The next step would be to determine what information needs to be shared with and with whom. So does information need to be shared with students or other staff? And kind of how does the team want to go about sharing that information while also maintaining privacy, being respectful and maintaining confidentiality? The next step would be to identify the physical and or psychological victims of the crisis. So is it an individual? Is it a group of individuals? Who else has been impacted? Are there teachers? And so kind of identifying all the individuals that are experiencing the crisis or responding to it. The next step, step 4, would be to provide crisis intervention services. So deciding what intervention should be provided and if the victim needs professional mental health intervention, such as for like suicidal or homicidal thinking. And then finally, following a crisis, the team should debrief and engage in evaluation of the response and preparedness. So then once you have the team and you kind of have outlined procedures, there is all sorts of different types of behaviors and crises that can arise in school settings. And we will go over a few and what their risk factors are, triggers, warning signs, ways to prevent them, and when to seek out additional help. So our first behavior would be aggression and violence. And so the major risk factors impacting aggression and violence is like growing up in community violence, experiencing or witnessing domestic violence, abuse, neglect, bullying, and overcrowded classrooms. If the child has a learning disability or an intellectual disability, and also children at a young age have a higher risk of expressing themselves with aggression or violence. And then psychiatric illnesses like autism, ADHD, oppositional defiance disorder, conduct disorder, anxiety disorders, OCD, mood disorders, psychosis, PTSD, and substance abuse also can impact the likelihood of a child expressing themselves aggressively or violently. Some of the triggers that school personnel should be aware of are teasing, given classwork that is too difficult, if the child is hungry or in pain, or if they are being reminded of traumatic experiences or abuse, as well as feeling scared or anxious or overstimulated. And so some of the warning signs of this is noticing that a child becomes agitated. So really, if the student is showing any signs of agitation, it's important to try to find a trusted adult to help and seek to understand why the child is feeling upset, remove any stressors or triggers, as well as potentially remove any children or potentially dangerous objects in the room in case it does escalate. And then in order, if a child needs additional help, they can seek outpatient support if there's signs of depression, anxiety, ADHD, autism, or any other psychiatric diagnoses. And the student should contact the emergency room if there's suicidal or homicidal threats or plans or abuse at home. Our next behavior is suicide and self-injurious behavior. So some of the risk factors include prior suicide by a peer or a family member, domestic violence, abuse, neglect, bullying, social isolation, and family stress. A child can also be at higher risk if they experience depression, impulsivity, if they have previous self-harm or suicide attempts, if they are experiencing any hopelessness or ideas about death as relief. Also sleep problems, a history of abuse or trauma, substance use, difficulties with communication or problem solving, and being a sexual minority youth. And then some other psychiatric illnesses that can impact this are mood disorders, substance use, PTSD and trauma, psychosis, ASD, ADHD, OCD, and anxiety. And some of the triggers include feeling shame or rejection, teasing by peers, a breakup or a loss of someone important, reminders of trauma and abuse, or family conflict. So some of the warning signs are typically physical evidence of any type of cutting or burning, talking about death or dying, alcohol or drug use, expressing hopelessness about the future, having experienced a recent loss. School personnel should be aware of any acute changes in personality or motivation, any social withdrawal or loss of interest in activities, as well if they've noticed any poor sleep, poor eating or hygiene or concentration problems, changes in school performance, as well as bizarre or erratic behavior, low self-esteem, guilt, or feelings of worthlessness. And so if a child reports any suicidal thoughts or intentionally harms themselves recently, or if they're significantly depressed or hopeless and cannot find ways to cope, if an adult feels unsure that the child will be safe, then they should seek out additional support through emergency room or outpatient settings. Our next behavior are tantrums and behavioral outbursts. So risk factors for tantrums and behavioral outbursts include family stress, feeling depressed, anxious, or a medically ill parent, domestic violence, physical discipline at home, any type of neglect, so feeling hungry or not sleeping, chaotic home environments or multiple caregivers. If a child has an unrecognized learning disability or any social deficits, intellectual disability, medical illness, if they feel tired or hungry, pain, or any discomfort. And then again, if they're experiencing any psychiatric illnesses. Triggers include teasing in classwork that's too difficult, hunger, pain, stress, and then particularly for students with autism spectrum disorder, overstimulation can be a big trigger. Warning signs. So most tantrums have a ramp up period, and that is when there's a really subtle change in emotion. And that is when the adult or school personnel should first try to intervene. However, once the ramp up period changes to anger, the adult should wait, and it should last about 90 seconds before the child goes back into just distress. So waiting about 2 minutes before intervening after the anger stage, and wait for kind of like silence, and then kind of talk to the student and figure out how you can support them. And then they should seek out any outpatient support if there's suspected psychiatric diagnoses. So then we have kind of like the odd behaviors, and there's like a very wide range of what can be considered normal or odd behaviors, but it's important to recognize just in general that if a child is not functioning well, like globally, or if there's a sudden change of behavior, this could cause or be a sign of a crisis. And that introversion and being quiet is natural, but sometimes children with big emotions and disruptive behaviors are noticed quicker, whereas quiet children can be overlooked when there's distress building. So if they're not functioning at the same level as their peers, the introversion is likely having some type of impact on their self-image or self-esteem, and can reflect a significant underlying issue. So some of the risk factors of these odd behaviors include a learning disability, language or intellectual disability, disinterest or inability to maintain friendships, psychiatric disorders. And then warning signs include sudden changes in behaviors, changes in the environment or dynamics, and then finding out if the behavior is isolated to school or if there's also changes in behavior at home. And then to seek out additional help if there is a psychiatric diagnosis, and then seeking child protective services or emergency room support if there's abuse, neglect, malnutrition, psychosis, or drug use or intoxication. So the next one is child abuse and trauma. So some of the risk factors involved include abuse and maltreatment, such as physical, intellectual disability, emotional behavioral problems, poverty, family stressors, foster care, or dangerous or violent community. And then for trauma, there can be physical, unexplained bruises, injuries, burns, poor hygiene, dirty clothes, unmet medical needs, poor nutrition or emaciation, or behavioral, sudden change in behavior, onset of hyperactivity, aggression, withdrawal, or self-interest behaviors or truancy. So some of the triggers include reminders of the trauma, flashbacks, intrusive memories, noticing the fight, flight, or freeze responses. They might not be immediately obvious, but if they are, they can be triggers. And then holidays, behaviors, birthdays, and foster care. So then some of the warning signs are overreacting to things in the environment, like adults shouting with excitement or talking loudly could be perceived as dangerous by someone who's experienced child abuse or trauma. Sudden changes in social interactions or academic achievement, and then again, bruises, burns, injuries. If the child is fearful of the parent or other adults, or if they're suddenly terrified of physical contact. So it's important to seek additional help if there are any psychiatric disorders, and then also the emergency room if there's any abuse resulting in needing an immediate psychological or physical exam, or if there's suicidal or homicidal thoughts. So this flow chart kind of shows how we can catch the warning signs of abuse and trauma and identify kids, and then determine if you're working with a traumatized child or a child who is abused, the steps you can take to de-escalate and collaborate with the student to find a solution, and when to refer the child to an emergency room. But we won't go through all of this. And then the last major behavior is risky behaviors. So students who are at risk of engaging in risky behaviors may have peers who are also engaging in these types of behaviors. They may have a lack of adult supervision. Alcohol or medications might be available at home. If the child is prone to impulsivity or grandiosity, and then if they have any psychiatric disorders, such as ADHD, a disruptive behavior disorder, mood disorder, anxiety, or PTSD. Some of the warning signs include changes in the child's mood, such as depression, mania, or worsening anxiety, and then any environmental changes. So it's important to seek additional help and involve parents and schools as necessary. Refer to the outpatient if there's a suspected medical health or mental health, or if there's failed interventions, and then the ER if there's an intoxicated or medically ill, or if the student is engaged in behavior that is an immediate risk. So then moving on, in a lot of schools and inpatient settings, many of these crises are kind of dealt with using physical restraint and seclusion, and that's used to de-escalate students in crisis. And so specifically, restraint refers to a physical intervention, either through therapeutic holding by staff or through mechanical restraining tools. Seclusion is generally defined as the placement of a person in a specifically designed room in order to de-escalate and control behaviors and assure physical safety. According to federal data, more than 100,000 students are restrained or secluded in US public schools every year, and nearly 4 out of 5 of those students who are restrained or secluded are students with disabilities. And so the use of restraint and seclusion typically result from a failure to use techniques that may have prevented the behaviors that led to the restraint and seclusion, or failure to effectively intervene early on at the first sign of inappropriate behaviors. There is very little empirical evidence to support the efficacy of restraint for any purpose, whether it be therapeutic or otherwise. And there are a lot of negative effects of using physical restraint and seclusion. These procedures are considered to be really coercive and have the potential to further escalate physical conflicts or reduce a treatment alliance. Physical restraint can be a distressing practice for both youth and staff. Restraint and seclusion practices can result in reduced quality of care, less engagement of youth and families. Seclusion can cause an increase in anxiety, fear, anger, and hostility, as well as power struggles between staff and children. Physical restraint can also be perceived by youth as offensive, and it will weaken the relationship between the child and the staff and impact the youth's perception of safety in the school or institution. So then looking at this one study, which explored crisis intervention that emphasized trust in high quality relationships between children and practitioners, particularly in a residential treatment facility. The intervention used a curriculum called Shifting Gears, conflict avoidance through working partnerships. The practitioners at the residential treatment facility received about 18 to 20 hours of training that focused on crisis prevention. The 3 units of the curriculum included a close, trusting relationship is the best prevention, people in crisis, which explored different factors that influence crisis behavior, and filling your de-escalation toolbox, which provided techniques to help calm an agitated client. There was also a section on the last tool in your toolbox, which was select physical interventions only to be used as a last resort in emergencies. And so this graph can show us the results that suggest the curriculum and Shifting Gears may have contributed to a decrease in restraint and an increase in preventative and proactive strategies. So you can see over 1, 2, 3, 4 months before the intervention, there was a much higher rate of physical restraints. And then after the intervention of the curriculum, it was much lower.
Now we're going to talk more in depth about de-escalation, and this mainly revolves around violent outbursts. So the importance of de-escalation skills, first of all, we want to prevent dangerous situations in schools. In addition, students and teachers often drop out of school citing school climate and lack of support as the reason. We'll talk more in depth about the school to prison pipeline next. And of course, creating a physically and psychologically safe environment should be everyone's goal. More and more schools are relying on school resource officers, and schools with officers had nearly 5 times the rate of arrests for disorderly conduct as schools without one. When a school allows a school resource officer to arrest a student or refers a student to law enforcement or juvenile court as a form of discipline, they're turning that student over to the juvenile justice system. That makes it much easier for a student to get a juvenile record. And that's where students get stuck in this system and have difficulty ever breaking out of it. Students are also more likely to drop out if they have been in contact with the juvenile justice system. More and more schools are relying on, So schools throughout the US have adopted zero tolerance policies. And there's a widespread belief that this is the only effective response to misbehavior is punishment delivered quickly and decisively, and that softer approaches lead to students getting away with bad behavior. But removing students from schools just moves the problem back into the community and alienates the student. Zero tolerance policies erode school climate and promotes a structure that is prison-like. It has been argued that the use of harsh punishment and the use of guards and police present have been contributing to the problem, and evidence for improved academic achievement due to these policies have not been The school to prison pipeline also ends up targeting marginalized students. As Rachel stated earlier, the civil rights data collection found that a disproportionate amount of students of color and students with disabilities in the US are subjected to restraint, seclusion, suspension, and expulsion. So students are suspended or expelled for discretionary violation are nearly 3 times more likely to be in contact with the juvenile justice system the following year. Black students are suspended and expelled 3 times more than white students. And Black students represent 31% of school-related offenses. Now we're going to talk about some do's and don'ts of de-escalation. Filling the bucket means intentionally spending time getting to know kids, especially the ones that are vulnerable. Every time you have a positive interaction with a student, you are putting water in the bucket. So when you do walk into a crisis, you already have that relationship established. What matters is what you do before the crisis occurs. The most effective de-escalation tool is the rapport you have continually built with the student before the outburst. When we allow judgment or anger or irritation to show up, our relationships with those students suffer. And we should always be seeking input from students, especially from kids who are most directly affected by these zero tolerance policies. What we don't want to do is publicly humiliate a student. Not only does this do harm to your relationship with that student, it demonstrates to other students what kind of environment they are in. So we do want to deliver consequences in a way that does not publicly humiliate the student. We do want to shift the narrative we have about the student. Negative perceptions will be communicated verbally or non-verbally. Be genuine with your concern. Pathology can help inform us, but it's imperative that we don't use it against them. Anyone intervening effectively in a crisis must practice unconditional positive regard for the student. Students are always, no matter what, deserving of our respect. Aim to step inside the student's experience and reframe that situation from their perspective. It is often a misconception that disruptive behavior is motivated by power and control, but stepping into someone's perspective reveals that there's so much more going on under the surface. So recognize that this is just a person in a bad place. While ultimately we want compliance from the student, demanding it while a student is actively escalated is not likely to work. Also, be willing to admit mistakes and apologize to students when it's appropriate. By owning our actions, even when they aren't ideal, we model showing respect to students. Demanding respect without showing it doesn't work. Also, don't take things personally. Sometimes we are the trigger, and we need to acknowledge that and take a step back. When you get stuck, that's the time to tag in someone else who preferably has a good rapport with the student. Sometimes when we get stuck, the instinct is to double down on our approach. And sometimes we do this because we worry that struggling is evidence of our incompetence, but really it can just mean that we have exhausted our ideas. And backing students into a corner may increase chances of a violent confrontation. Remember that an escalated adult cannot de-escalate an escalated child. Let's talk about self-management strategies. Triggers. If you don't know your triggers, students will find them for you, and you don't want to be caught off guard. So effective de-escalation involves some prior introspection. Sometimes student behavior can be shocking and seemingly come out of nowhere. It's important to take a second to collect yourself and think about how to respond rather than a knee-jerk reaction. Self-talk can help with regulation. Using short phrases like remember to breathe can be helpful. Maintaining the humanity of the student in an active crisis is paramount to productive communication. Sometimes empathy is a decision. To be empathetic to someone we agree with is easy. The challenge is putting our own perceptions and judgments aside and adopting a constructive narrative about the student. I like this quote. This is the communication warrior's real service, staying calm in the middle of conflict, deflecting verbal abuse, and offering empathy in the face of antagonism. If you cannot empathize with people, you don't stand a chance of getting them to listen to you, much less accepting your attempts to help, sincere as you might be. This is where curiosity and listening come into play. Understand that when a person is in active crisis, they cannot access the part of their brains that help them regulate and are often flooded by stress hormones. They likely cannot process logically what is happening or relate to others. Many crisis intervention trainings advise educators to get directive and use short phrases like walk over here, sit down. But I'd like to pose a question that maybe we can discuss after the presentation. Do we think that that's always effective to make demands? And what situations call for that and which ones have wiggle room? So what we do want to do is create psychological space for students and be genuinely curious. Remember that it is not necessary to have all the answers, and it is much more important to have questions. Avoid asking closed-ended questions and instead ask short, open-ended questions like, how did we get here today? And allow for silence. Ask for specific details to avoid making assumptions as well. We all want to end crisis situations quickly and decisively, but the desire to bring it to a resolution too quickly may actually undermine the goal itself. When safety is involved, this becomes difficult. Never give swimming lessons to someone who is drowning. Create feelings of safety and mutual cooperation. Sometimes that means resisting the urge to offer advice and simply sitting with the person with a supportive and listening presence. Again, the desire to end situations quickly is often attempted through the use of demands, but impatience during a crisis can be counterproductive. I like this quote about premature problem solving. You've heard of grabbing victory from the jaws of defeat, right? Well, rushing to premature problem solving is just the opposite. It's grabbing defeat from the jaws of victory. You're getting somewhere and then bang, you blow it by offering solutions before the person is ready to hear them. This was actually said by an NYPD hostage negotiator, but we should all see ourselves as mediators as well. So remember, as educators, we play an important role in keeping kids safe in schools. Always use respect, dignity, empathy, curiosity, and active listening skills. It's up to us to create safe and responsive school climates. Thanks for attending our presentation. Do we have any questions?
Any questions?
I was just wondering if you guys can post this. This has been so helpful. I was wondering if you could post this in like the Google Drive so that we have access to this.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Any other questions, comments?
Do you want to tell them about the book?
Oh, sure. So I got a lot of information from actually this book, which is called Talk to Me. And it's what educators and others can learn about de-escalation from hostage negotiators. And it actually has a lot of great information that translates well into schools. So that was very helpful and I recommend it to everyone. And yeah, anything else? Okay, well, thank you.
Yes.
Okay, thank you both Megan and Rachel so much for presenting today. One big virtual round of applause to the both of them for presenting. If there are no last minute questions or comments, we will go ahead and conclude today's webinar. This presentation is recorded and will be published to the UTTEC Lab website and YouTube channel. For information regarding future webinars, as well as previous webinars like this one, you can always access the UTTEC Lab website by going to u-tteclab.com. Again, thank you everybody so much for joining us today, and I hope you have a wonderful day.